Marcus Ellison was 39 years old the morning his wife of 7 years stood in the doorway of their Charlotte, North Carolina home, a packed overnight bag at her feet, and told him the cruelest thing one person can say to another. She said it plainly, without raising her voice, the way you'd read an item off a grocery list. Even your own mother wouldn't miss you. She picked up the bag. She walked to the car. She drove away. Marcus stood at the kitchen counter, with his coffee cup still warm in both hands, and said nothing. He watched the reverse lights disappear around the curve of Ridgemont Drive, and he set the mug down on the tile he had laid himself, square by measured square, on a June Saturday 6 years prior. He was quiet for a long time. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his work jacket and retrieved the smaller of his two phones, the one Denise had never once seen. And he typed a single message to a number she did not know existed. It read, "Whenever you're ready." Then he drank his coffee. What Denise Ellison did not know, what she had never thought to ask in 7 years of marriage, was what her husband did in the hours before she woke, and in the hours after she fell asleep. She did not know his name appeared on 3 LLCs registered in North Carolina and 1 in Georgia. She did not know his mother, the woman she had just weaponized with a sentence, was the reason every dollar Marcus had ever touched had eventually multiplied. Because Lorraine Ellison, before she passed 14 months ago, had spent 31 years as a licensed contractor and had taught her only son to build things that were meant to last. Denise had also said that line about Marcus's mother at a dinner party once, where 6 people heard it. She had forgotten those 6 people. She should not have. What happened next would cost Denise everything she believed she had already won. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light came in flat and gray through the kitchen window, the way it did in Charlotte in October, and Marcus Ellison moved through the first floor of his house with the kind of quiet that had taken him years to understand was not sadness, but patience. He filled the percolator, the old stainless steel one his mother had kept on her own stovetop for 20 years before she gave it to him. He waited for it. On the counter to his right sat a wood-framed level, its bubble perfectly centered, the way he always left it, not because he was going to use it, but because he was a structural engineer and a man who let his tools speak for the kind of work he expected of himself. The kitchen floor was travertine he had selected and laid himself, a weekend project he'd undertaken the summer after their first anniversary. Denise had called it an obsession at the time, the measuring and remeasuring, the careful pressure of each tile setting into its mortar bed. He remembered she had brought him lemonade. He had thought then that she was the kind of woman who brought you lemonade when you worked. His mother used to stand at her own kitchen window and say, "Marcus, the man who builds for someone else's approval builds on sand." He had been maybe 14 when she first said it, watching her inspect the framing on a remodel job off Freedom Drive, her work belt around her waist and a pencil behind her ear. He hadn't understood it then. He did now. He and Denise had met at a continuing education seminar at UNC Charlotte. She was a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized healthcare firm, quick and ambitious, with a laugh that started in her shoulders. He had been 32. She had been 29. They'd gone to dinner at an Ethiopian place on Central Avenue that neither of them had been to before, and she had ordered without looking at the menu, and he had liked that about her, that confident carelessness. They were married 14 months later at a small ceremony in Concord that his mother attended in a dress she had sewn herself. Lorraine Ellison had held his face in both her hands before the ceremony and said, "Be a good husband. Be a better man." He had tried to be both. Somewhere in the last 3 years, Denise had stopped bringing lemonade. He had noticed. He had not said anything. That was his particular discipline. He observed. He cataloged. He waited for patterns to confirm themselves before he acted on them. It was how he approached structural analysis. It was how he approached his marriage. He had been watching the small things. The new perfume she did not mention buying. A name, Brennan, that appeared twice on her phone screen in one evening when she had set it face up on the coffee table. The way she had stopped asking how his day went and replaced it with a perfunctory everything okay that required only a nod. He was rinsing his mug when the first real signal came. Not Denise's departure that morning. That was a signal he had been expecting for 8 weeks. The real signal was the notification that appeared on his other phone at 7:43 a.m. from a number he'd set up 3 months prior with one purpose: to alert him when any transaction over $500 cleared from the joint savings account he and Denise still shared, the one with $18,200 in it. The notification read, "Transaction confirmed. $18,200 payee. External transfer." Marcus set the mug in the rack. He dried his hands. He sat down at the kitchen table, opened the phone, and began. He did not move to the living room. He did not call Denise. He sat at the kitchen table he had built from reclaimed oak, the table that had taken 3 weekends and a borrowed router, and he opened the accounts application with the same composure he brought to load-bearing calculations. The joint savings account showed a zero balance and a single transfer to an external routing number he did not recognize. The joint checking account, the one where his direct deposit landed every other Friday, showed $1,640 and a pending transfer, not yet cleared, of $1,200 to the same external routing number. He took screenshots of both screens. He forwarded them to an email address Denise did not know existed. His hands did not shake. He moved to his laptop, the one in the second bedroom, the room Denise had repurposed as a home office, and which Marcus had entered perhaps twice in the last year. He used his own login to pull 3 months of bank statements that were accessible through their shared financial institution. He printed them to PDF. Then, he opened a separate browser and logged into the joint investment account, an account Denise had told him 18 months ago she had closed because we weren't doing anything with it. The account was not closed. It showed a balance of $7,400 and a series of systematic monthly withdrawals of $600, beginning in March of the previous year. 14 months. $8,400 extracted in increments, just small enough to avoid triggering the account's automated alerts. His face remained perfectly calm. He cross-referenced the dates of the withdrawals against a note he pulled from his phone, a running record he had begun keeping in August after the second time Denise had mentioned, without prompting, that his name was not on her car's title and never had been. He had started keeping records then, not because he was certain, because he was thorough. He found the pattern inside 90 minutes. The external routing number from the savings transfer matched an account at a regional credit union. He found a statement left in the printer tray one evening 4 months ago, which he had photographed and not mentioned, that showed the credit union account belonged to a joint holder, Denise Ellison and Brennan Marsh. He searched Brennan Marsh, senior account manager at a commercial real estate firm in Ballantyne, 7 years older than Denise, divorced once. A LinkedIn profile that showed a man in the kind of open collar shirts that communicated an easeful confidence Marcus had always found performed. He found Brennan Marsh's address using public property records. He found that 3 weeks prior, Denise's name had been added as a co-applicant on a lease for a 2-bedroom apartment in Dilworth. 26 months of calculated extraction, mapped out before him on the kitchen table his hands had built, in a house that bore his name on the deed and his mother's spirit in every fastened joint. He opened a new folder on his desktop. He named it simply Lorraine. Then he picked up his other phone and called the one person he knew would understand exactly what he needed. Patricia Osei's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Tryon Street, and it smelled like wood smoke and paper, which Marcus had always found steadying. She was 57, a family law and asset protection attorney who had handled 3 major divorce proceedings referred to her by Marcus's financial advisor, and she wore reading glasses on a beaded chain that she used like punctuation, sliding them on when she wanted to signal she was about to say something final. She reviewed the folder Marcus placed on her desk, printed bank statements, the credit union document, the property record, the screenshots, and she did not flinch at any of it. Systematic and premeditated, she said, without looking up. She was quiet for a moment. She started the extraction before she had the replacement relationship locked in. That tells me she'd been planning an exit long before Marsh was in the picture. She slid her glasses on. Marcus, you have documentation of marital waste, financial fraud, and given the joint account transfer this morning, potentially wire fraud. North Carolina is an equitable distribution state. With this evidence, we're not splitting anything. We're recovering. She looked at him over the frames. You didn't react when she left this morning. It was not a question. No, Marcus said. Good. She set the papers in a neat stack. Don't. Patricia set her glasses on the table and looked at him with the particular directness of someone who had spent 30 years watching men and women discover, in document form, the precise shape of a betrayal they had already suspected in their bones. One more thing, she said. I want to flag something in the credit union filing. Marsh Co. signed the account, yes, but the initial deposit, $12,000, made 14 months ago, came from an account in his name alone. She paused. That's not spontaneous. That's a funded exit strategy. She slid the document across the desk with 2 fingers. He was already planning a life with your wife before she had fully decided to leave you. That matters for the fraud claim. It puts him inside the conspiracy, not just adjacent to it. Marcus looked at the document. He thought about the watch Brennan Marsh wore in his LinkedIn photo, a particular kind of mechanical watch. Swiss. The kind worn by men who believed that visible precision communicated internal order. He thought about Denise's face when she laughed, before the laughter became something she aimed rather than felt. He tucked the document into the folder and stood. He drove from her office to a neighborhood in Kannapolis he had not visited since his mother's funeral. His Uncle Curtis lived in the same ranch house he'd lived in for 40 years. Cream-colored brick. A persimmon tree in the yard that dropped its fruit on the sidewalk every fall, orange and uncollected. Curtis Ellison was 68, a retired plumber, a man who had worked alongside Lorraine on half the renovation jobs she'd ever taken, and who had known Marcus since before he could speak in complete sentences. He opened the door before Marcus knocked. Figured you'd be coming, Curtis said. He stepped back to let him in. They sat at the kitchen table. Curtis poured sweet tea without asking. He listened to everything Marcus said without interrupting, and then he was quiet for a while, his big hands folded around the glass. She said that about your mother, Curtis said. Not a question either. At the door, Marcus said. On her way out. Curtis nodded slowly. He looked at the window. Lorraine knew, he said. Told me at Thanksgiving, 2 years ago. Said the girl had eyes that were always calculating the next step instead of being where she was. Said she didn't know how to just sit at a table. He looked at Marcus. Your mama kept it to herself because she didn't want to be the reason. She wanted you to see it yourself. He set the glass down. You see it now. Marcus said yes. Then you know what to do. Curtis looked at him steady. A man who builds for the right reasons keeps the receipts. Keep yours. Back in his car, Marcus called his financial advisor, a man named Devin Price, who had been managing Marcus's private portfolio for 4 years, a portfolio that included a 22% stake in a commercial logistics company that his college roommate had founded, and which had been acquired 18 months ago in a transaction that, after taxes and distributions, had deposited $340,000 into a trust account registered in Marcus's name alone. A trust that existed before his marriage, that had been specifically structured, at Lorraine Ellison's insistence, on the advice of an estate attorney she had consulted herself, because she had watched other people's children lose everything to the wrong partner, to be held outside of marital assets. Devin confirmed what Marcus already knew. The trust was untouchable. Marcus asked him to prepare a full portfolio summary for Patricia's office by end of week. While Devin talked, Marcus pulled up a property record search on his other phone. He found that Brennan Marsh had been named in a civil action in Wake County 7 years prior. A former girlfriend, a domestic partnership, a similar pattern of joint account access that had ended in a disputed $21,000 transfer. The case had been settled privately. The plaintiff had moved out of state. The record existed, though, filed and indexed, and sitting in a county clerk's database exactly where Marcus had just found it. The way structural defects tended to survive in the documents, even when the building had been patched over and repainted. He forwarded the court docket to Patricia with one line: prior pattern. Wake County, 2017. He put the phone down and drove. That evening, Marcus came home to the house on Ridgemont Drive and set his keys on the hook and warmed the soup he'd made the day before and ate at the oak table by himself in the quiet. He answered 3 work emails. Denise had not called, had not texted. Her absence was being performed for an audience that only existed in her own head. She was waiting for him to reach out and confirm he was as small as she had left him. He was not going to confirm that. He went to bed at 10:15. He lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around him. The small sounds of joists and pipe, and the old oak at the property line that brushed the back gutter in the wind. And he felt something he might have called grief, but wasn't quite. It was closer to the feeling you got when a structure you'd over-engineered for safety finally transferred its load to the right columns. Real power. He had once read in a material science paper about prestressed concrete did not come from visible force. It came from tension held deliberately, in the right places, for the right duration, until the structure was ready to bear what it was built for. He slept well. The mediation room was on the 2nd floor of a building on South Boulevard, and Patricia had arranged it deliberately. Not a conference room, a mediation room, with a rectangular table and 6 chairs and a credenza against the far wall. Marcus arrived first and sat on the east side of the table. Patricia sat to his left. Devin Price sat to his right, with a leather portfolio in front of him. Marcus's Uncle Curtis sat at the far end, quiet and still in his good gray suit, the one he had worn to Lorraine's funeral, because Marcus had asked him to be there, and he had not asked why. Denise arrived with Brennan Marsh, which is what Marcus had expected. Brennan wore an open-collar shirt and the kind of watch that broadcast income without announcing it. Denise wore a charcoal blazer and the expression of a woman arriving to collect something already promised to her. They had brought their own attorney, a man named Stokes, who had an aggressive handshake and no reading glasses, which Patricia had told Marcus meant he was either very confident or very unprepared. Denise looked at her uncle, and then at Marcus, and her expression shifted by a degree. Not fear yet, just recalibration. "We can make this simple," Stokes said. "We can," Patricia agreed, and opened her folder. She laid out the bank documents first. The savings account transfer. The systematic investment account withdrawals. The credit union account in Denise and Brennan's joint names opened 14 months ago. the Leaseco application in Dilworth. She laid each one flat on the table, with the same measured patience Marcus used when he was presenting a structural report to a client, item by item, no commentary, letting the documentation speak. Denise's composure held through the first 4 documents. It did not hold through the 5th, which was a printout of a text thread between Denise and Brennan, obtained legally through the credit union's fraud investigation that Patricia had quietly initiated 2 weeks prior, in which Brennan had written, "Once the savings clear, we're good. The trust account is the only thing left to deal with." And Denise had replied, "He doesn't even know about the trust. He never checks anything." Brennan shifted in his chair. Devin Price opened his portfolio. The trust account, he said, was established 6 years before the marriage. It is registered as a separate property asset under North Carolina General Statute 5020, was documented as such in a prenuptial filing that Miss Ellison signed and initialed on page 4, and has no marital commingling recorded in any of the 7 years of the marriage. He turned the trust summary around and slid it across the table. It is not available for equitable distribution. It never was. Denise looked at Marcus. This was the first time since she had arrived that she had looked directly at him. Marcus looked back at her without urgency. He had spent 20 years learning to read structural failures, the hairline crack that preceded the collapse, the load point that had been quietly exceeding its capacity for months before anyone called it. He saw it now, spreading across her face in the silence of that room. "Marcus," she said, and her voice had changed registers. "I know this looks bad. I was scared. I panicked. I made mistakes, but we can." "No," said Curtis Ellison from the far end of the table. His voice was quiet and absolute, and none of them had heard him speak until this moment. He was looking at Denise, and he was not unkind, but he was entirely unmoved. You don't get to pivot to fear after the first 30 documents. He folded his hands. His mama would have had something to say about that, too, since you brought her up. The room was still. Marcus stood. He gathered nothing. There was nothing to gather. Patricia had the copies. Devin had the portfolio. Curtis stood and straightened his jacket. Marcus buttoned the middle button of his coat and looked at Denise one final time and said the only thing he had planned to say. "I spent 7 years building something I believed in, and I built it well enough that you couldn't take the parts that mattered even when you tried. I don't know if that means I was right to build it, but I know how to read a load report." He paused. "You never asked me what I built. That was always the problem." He turned. He walked to the door. He did not look back. Behind him, the room was very quiet, and in that quiet was the exact sound of everything Denise Ellison had believed she was walking away with collapsing into its own footprint. 11 months later, Marcus stood on the back deck of a house in the Cotswold neighborhood, a house he had purchased with his own name on the deed and no other, a 1960s ranch that he had spent 6 months gutting and restoring with the meticulous care of a man for whom building was not a metaphor, but a fact. The deck itself he had designed and constructed, board by board from pressure, treated pine, with a railing height precisely 42 inches to code, because he had never in his life built anything out of standard that was not also to standard. In September, he had been awarded a project management contract for a $2.7 million mixed-use restoration in the Noda Arts District, the largest independent contract of his career, and one that bore his firm's name alone on the letterhead for the first time. There was a Japanese maple at the property edge that he had planted in early spring, a tree he had selected from the nursery the same week Patricia had filed the final paperwork, because he had needed something to do with his hands on a Saturday that felt like it should be marked with a living thing. It had turned orange and red with the October air, the colors of a persimmon, and he stood looking at it with his coffee in both hands. Beside him, sitting on the top step with her own coffee and a book open across her knee, was a woman named Renee Okafor, a civil engineer he had met at the restoration project in Noda. A woman with precise questions and no interest in performing anything for anyone's benefit. She had asked him on their first real evening together what he was building next, and he had told her honestly, and she had leaned forward in her chair with a look of specific technical interest that had told him everything he needed to know. She was present in the way his mother had always told him to look for, sitting at the table fully, not watching the door. Patricia had called him in August with the final numbers. The marital waste claim had been sustained. The fraudulent transfer had been reversed in full. The civil judgment against Brennan Marsh, who had, it emerged in pretrial discovery, run a nearly identical scheme with a previous partner in Raleigh 7 years prior. The one Marcus had found in the Wake County records totaled $64,000 across both actions, and his real estate firm had quietly terminated his employment when the filing became public record. Marsh had relocated to a smaller city in the Piedmont. His open-collar confidence, apparently, had not traveled well without a funded account to back it. Denise was managing marketing communications for a regional flooring supply company in Gastonia. She had not responded to the civil judgment in the time allotted, and was now subject to a wage garnishment that Patricia had characterized as the most straightforward she had ever filed. Her mother, a woman Marcus had always respected for her directness, had stopped calling her after the proceedings concluded, and the full documentation became part of the public record. Her former best friend, the woman who had been maid of honor at their wedding, who had been one of the 6 people at the dinner party, where Denise had said the thing about Marcus's mother, had sent Marcus a card in May that said only, "I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner." He had appreciated that. He had set it on the mantelpiece he had restored himself, and left it there for a week before putting it away. Marcus finished his coffee. Renee turned a page. The maple moved slightly in the wind, its orange leaves catching the morning light and releasing it. He thought about his mother standing in front of that remodel job off Freedom Drive, her pencil behind her ear, telling him that the man who built for someone else's approval built on sand. He thought about Curtis in his good gray suit at the end of a table, steady as a load-bearing wall. He had built everything worth keeping. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.